Chapter 1. Europe on the Brink of War 179 to 1801. The road to Copenhagen. In 1792, Europe entered one of the most turbulent eras in its history. The French Revolution had shattered the old political order, igniting a conflict that would rage across the continent for more than 2 decades. What began as a revolution soon evolved into a struggle for supremacy, one that would reshape the balance of power not only in Europe, but across the globe. It was a war fought on vast battlefields, across distant colonies, and on the world's oceans. Among the many rivalries that emerged during this period, none proved more enduring than the bitter contest between France and Great Britain. France possessed the largest army in Europe, capable of dominating campaigns on land under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. Britain, however, relied on a different weapon. Protected by the English Channel and sustained by its growing empire, the nation placed its survival in the hands of the Royal Navy. By the turn of the 19th century, Britain's fleet had become the most powerful naval force in the world. Commanded by experienced officers and disciplined crews, it controlled vital trade routes, enforced devastating blockades, and projected British influence far beyond European waters. Among its many distinguished commanders, one name stood above all others: Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson was unlike any officer of his generation. Fearless in battle, unconventional in strategy, and capable of inspiring fierce loyalty from his captains. He had already secured legendary victories at Cape St. Vincent and the Battle of the Nile. His body bore the scars of war. He had lost an arm in combat and the sight in one eye, yet these injuries only strengthened his reputation as a commander willing to sacrifice everything for victory. To the British public, Nelson was already becoming a national hero. But while Britain's navy appeared stronger than ever, the political situation across Europe was growing increasingly dangerous. In June 1800, Napoleon crushed the Austrian army at the Battle of Marengo, effectively destroying the second coalition that had opposed revolutionary France. Austria was forced to seek peace, leaving Britain increasingly isolated. Even more alarming for London, Tsar Paul I of Russia began reconsidering his relationship with France. Once Britain's ally, the Russian emperor now viewed Britain with growing hostility. The source of his anger lay in Britain's aggressive naval policies. After capturing Malta from the French, Britain refused to return the island to the Knights of St. John, whose Grand Master was none other than Tsar Paul himself. At the same time, the Royal Navy insisted on stopping, searching, and detaining neutral merchant vessels suspected of carrying supplies to France, while Britain considered these actions essential to maintaining its blockade. Many European powers saw them as blatant violations of international trade. Frustration soon united several of Europe's neutral states. In 1800, Russia, Denmark, Sweden, and Prussia formed the League of Armed Neutrality. Together, they pledged to defend the rights of neutral shipping against British interference. For Britain, the implications were profound. If neutral ships could no longer be inspected, French merchants would gain a steady flow of supplies despite the blockade. Worse still, the Baltic Sea provided Britain with essential naval materials: timber, tar, hemp, and other resources necessary to build and maintain the Royal Navy. Should these northern powers unite against Britain, they could threaten not only British commerce, but also the very foundation of its naval supremacy. The British government concluded that waiting would only strengthen the alliance. Decisive action was required before the League could coordinate its combined fleets. Rather than confront Russia directly, Britain chose the alliance's most vulnerable member, Denmark. To carry out the mission, a powerful fleet of more than 50 vessels was assembled under Admiral Sir Hyde Parker. Serving as his second-in-command was Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, whose reputation for aggressive action made him the ideal commander for the dangerous operation ahead. Their destination was Copenhagen. Britain delivered a final ultimatum to the Danish government. Denmark was ordered to withdraw from the League of Armed Neutrality and allow British warships safe passage through the Danish Straits. Refusal would mean war. The Danish government rejected the demands. For Nelson, every passing day favored the enemy. Russia's fleet remained trapped by winter ice, and Sweden had not yet completed its mobilization. Denmark stood isolated. If Britain struck immediately, victory seemed possible before the Northern Alliance could respond. Nelson urged Admiral Parker not to hesitate. Not a moment should be lost in attacking the enemy. Every hour and every day will make them stronger. We shall never meet them on better terms than we do now, but Parker was cautious by nature. Unfavorable winds, combined with his reluctance to commit the fleet too quickly, delayed the expedition for several critical days. By the time the British finally reached Copenhagen on March 30th, 1801, the Danes had used every available hour to strengthen their defenses. The opportunity for an easy victory had vanished. As darkness fell, Parker and Nelson personally surveyed Copenhagen harbor by boat. What they discovered was formidable. Warships had been anchored in defensive lines across the entrance, supported by floating batteries, powerful coastal fortifications, and dangerous shoals that threatened any ship attempting to enter the harbor. Even vessels no longer fit for sea had been transformed into floating gun platforms, creating a deadly barrier across the King's Deep Channel. The coming battle would demand more than courage. It would require one of the boldest naval plans ever attempted. Chapter 2, Planning the Impossible, the Assault on Copenhagen. By the evening of March 30th, 1801, the British fleet lay off Copenhagen. Any hopes of catching the Danes unprepared had disappeared. During the delay, Denmark had transformed its harbor into one of the strongest defensive positions in Northern Europe. The entrance to Copenhagen was protected not only by warships and heavy coastal batteries, but also by nature itself. Narrow channels wound between hidden sandbanks and treacherous shoals, leaving only a single deep water route known as the King's Deep. Any ship that strayed even slightly from the channel risked running aground under the guns of the enemy. Along the eastern edge of the channel, the Danes had anchored 18 warships in a continuous defensive line. Many of these vessels were no longer seaworthy, but that hardly mattered. Stripped of their masts and permanently moored, they had become floating fortresses, each mounting rows of heavy cannon capable of devastating any ship that ventured too close. Supporting them were smaller gunboats, floating batteries, and shore defenses manned by soldiers, sailors, and hundreds of civilian volunteers. At the northern entrance to the harbor stood the massive Trekroner fort, armed with dozens of heavy guns and mortar that dominated the approaches. For any attacking fleet, Copenhagen was a fortress built upon both engineering and geography. Admiral Sir Hyde Parker understood the danger. Although cautious by temperament, he also recognized that no one in the Royal Navy possessed greater tactical imagination than Horatio Nelson. Parker therefore entrusted his second-in-command with complete responsibility for planning and leading the assault. It was an extraordinary vote of confidence. Nelson immediately began studying every detail of the harbor. Rather than launch a broad attack across the entire Danish line, he proposed something far more daring. Instead of overwhelming the defenders with numbers, he would concentrate his strongest ships against the southern section of the Danish defenses, breaking through one portion before the enemy could effectively respond. Nelson requested only 10 ships of the line for the operation. Parker, perhaps recognizing the scale of the challenge, increased the force to 12. While Parker remained to the northeast with the largest ships as a covering force, Nelson would personally lead the attack from the south. Supporting him would be Captain Edward Riou's frigate squadron, bomb vessels armed with heavy mortar, gun brigs, sloops, and hundreds of Royal Marines prepared to assault coastal positions if necessary. Every vessel had a precise role to play. There would be no room for confusion once the battle began. On April 1st, Nelson sailed his force down the outer channel in full view of the Danish defenders before dropping anchor to await favorable winds. Throughout the day, both sides watched one another in tense silence. Neither fleet fired a shot. Each commander understood that the following morning would decide the fate of the campaign. That evening, Nelson gathered all of his captains aboard his flagship, HMS Elephant. The atmosphere was remarkably calm. Over dinner, the officers discussed the coming battle, shared a final toast to favorable wines and victory, and reviewed the complex operation one last time. But once the meal ended, Nelson returned to work. Long into the night, he personally drafted detailed written instructions for every captain in his command. Each ship was assigned a specific enemy target, exact anchoring position, and clear sequence of action. Unlike many admirals who relied on signals during battle, Nelson believed that every captain should already know precisely what was expected before the first cannon fired. Meanwhile, Captain Thomas Hardy undertook one of the most dangerous missions of the expedition. Under cover of darkness, Hardy led small boats toward the Danish defenses to measure the depth of the narrow channel, working almost beneath the enemy's guns. His crews carefully took soundings that would determine whether Nelson's ships could safely reach their assigned positions. It was painstaking work. One mistake in the navigation could doom an entire ship before it ever entered combat. Although the British enjoyed superior training and discipline, Nelson understood that victory was far from guaranteed. His 12 ships faced nearly the same weight of artillery as the Danish defensive line. The difference lay not in the number of guns, but in the men who served them. British crews were professionals, hardened by years of continuous warfare at sea. Their gunners could load and fire with extraordinary speed and precision. The Danish defenders presented a striking contrast. Many crews had been assembled only days before the battle, consisting of regular sailors alongside soldiers, militia, and civilian volunteers with little naval experience. Yet, despite their lack of training, they possessed one invaluable advantage. They were fighting for their own capital. Every gun fired in defense of Copenhagen carried the determination of men protecting their homes and families. At dawn on April 2nd, a favorable southern wind finally filled the British sails. At precisely 9:30 in the morning, Nelson gave the order to advance. The most daring naval assault of his career had begun. Chapter 3. The battle begins. Into the guns of Copenhagen. The morning of April 2nd, 1801, dawned clear over the waters outside Copenhagen. A steady southern wind filled the sails of the British fleet, carrying Nelson's squadron toward one of the most heavily defended harbors in Europe. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the attack began. Leading the advance was HMS Edgar, followed closely by the rest of Nelson's battle line. Every captain carried detailed written orders prepared the previous night, and each knew exactly where his ship was supposed to anchor and which Danish vessel it was expected to destroy. The plan depended on precision. There would be no opportunity to improvise once the fleet entered the narrow channel, but almost immediately, disaster struck. Before a single shot had been fired, HMS Agamemnon, Nelson's former flagship, drifted too close to the middle ground shoal. The ship ran hard aground, unable to continue the attack. One of Nelson's strongest ships had been lost before reaching the battlefield. It was a grim omen for an operation that relied on flawless navigation. Despite the setback, the remaining ships pressed forward. Half an hour later, Edgar entered range of the southernmost Danish defenses and unleashed the first broadside of the battle. Within moments, cannon fire erupted along the entire line. One after another, British ships reached their assigned positions, dropped anchor, and opened fire at point-blank range. Behind them, the following vessels carefully passed to the outside before anchoring opposite their own targets. The battle unfolded almost exactly as Nelson had envisioned. Each duel became a brutal contest between two ships locked in place, exchanging devastating broadsides across only a few hundred yards of water. Yet the greatest danger remained invisible. Beneath the smoke-covered surface lay the same hidden shoals that had already trapped Agamemnon. From aboard HMS Elephant, Nelson watched with growing concern as HMS Bellona drifted dangerously toward the middle ground. Signal flags flashed desperately from his flagship, warning the captain to alter course. The warning came too late. Bellona slammed onto the shoal and became hopelessly stranded. Nelson immediately adjusted his own course, steering Elephant into the position that Bellona had been intended to occupy. From there, his flagship engaged the floating batteries and nearby Danish warships with relentless fire. Realizing how easily additional ships could suffer the same fate, Nelson hoisted signal number 16, engage the enemy more closely. The famous order urged every captain to close the range and attack with maximum aggression, despite the dangers surrounding them. The situation soon worsened. Thick clouds of black gunpowder smoke drifted across the harbor, reducing visibility to almost nothing. In the confusion, HMS Russell lost her bearings and also struck the shoal. 3 powerful British ships now lay helplessly aground. Nearly a quarter of Nelson's striking force had been immobilized. Many commanders might have considered retreat. Nelson refused. Instead, he adapted instantly. Standing on the quarterdeck of Elephant, he shouted fresh orders to every passing captain, assigning new targets as ships sailed by. His carefully prepared battle plan was being rewritten in real time, yet discipline throughout the fleet remained remarkable. Within minutes, gaps created by the grounded vessels had been filled. The attack never lost momentum. Another crucial role now fell to Captain Edward Riou. Leading a squadron of frigates, Riou maneuvered lighter ships into positions that the larger ships of the line could not reach. HMS Desiree poured devastating fire into the southern end of the Danish defenses, while Riou's flagship, HMS Amazon, led the remaining frigates toward the northern batteries and the powerful Trekroner fort. These smaller vessels were hopelessly outgunned. Yet they sailed directly toward one of the strongest fortifications guarding Copenhagen harbor. The air filled with splintered timber, shattered rigging, and thick clouds of smoke that hid entire warships from view. Every broadside sent enormous shock waves across the water as cannonballs smashed through wooden hulls, tearing apart guns, masts, and the men who served them. Although the British had already lost 3 ships to the shoals, Nelson's rapid improvisation ensured that his remaining vessels still concentrated overwhelming firepower against the southern half of the Danish line. Superior British gunnery soon began to tell. Their crews, drilled through years of constant warfare, loaded and fired with astonishing speed and accuracy. But the Danish defenders refused to yield. Many had received little formal training. Some had joined their ships only hours before the battle began. Sailors stood beside soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary citizens who had never before fought in a naval engagement. Yet they fought with extraordinary determination. Even British officers later acknowledged the courage displayed by the defenders of Copenhagen. At the northern end of the British line, HMS Monarch and HMS Defiance endured the heaviest punishment of the day. Exposed to multiple enemy ships, while also under the guns of Trekroner fort, they absorbed an almost continuous bombardment. A cannonball struck Monarch, killing Captain James Moss instantly. By the end of the battle, nearly 40% of his crew would be dead or wounded. Still, the British guns continued firing without pause. Discipline never faltered. Gradually, the Danish line began to crack. One floating battery drifted helplessly from its position. The Danish flagship suffered catastrophic damage and burst into flames, forcing Commodore Olfert Fisher to transfer his command to another vessel. Elsewhere, shattered ships began sinking or drifting out of formation, while others struck their colors one after another. After more than 2 hours of relentless combat, Nelson's attack was beginning to overwhelm the southern defenses, but the battle was far from over. The most famous decision of Nelson's career was still moments away. Chapter 4: The Blind Eye, Nelson's Greatest Gamble. By early afternoon, the Battle of Copenhagen had reached a critical turning point. The British line remained locked in a brutal artillery duel, while thick clouds of gunpowder smoke drifted across the harbor, hiding much of the battlefield from view. From several miles offshore, Admiral Sir Hyde Parker struggled to understand what was happening. Unable to clearly distinguish victory from disaster, Parker could only make out a handful of grounded British ships signaling for assistance. To him, the attack appeared dangerously close to failure. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Parker made a decision. Signal number 39 climbed the rigging of his flagship. Discontinue the action. The order instructed Nelson to break off the attack and withdraw his squadron. The signal quickly spread through the fleet. Soon it reached HMS Elephant. When an officer pointed toward Parker's flagship, Nelson calmly turned to his flag captain, Thomas Foley. "You know, Foley," he remarked with a faint smile, "I have only one eye. I have a right to be blind sometimes." Then came the moment that would become one of the most famous stories in naval history. Nelson lifted his telescope not to his good eye but deliberately to the blind one. After staring for a moment, he lowered it again. "I really do not see the signal." It was an act of calculated defiance. Nelson believed the battle had not been lost. He believed victory was within reach, and he refused to abandon it. In truth, Parker had anticipated exactly this response. His signal was intended less as a strict command than as permission for Nelson to withdraw honorably if the situation became hopeless. He fully expected that, if any chance of success remained, Nelson would ignore the order. Nelson acknowledged Parker's signal but never repeated it to the rest of his squadron. His ships continued firing. The battle raged on. Not everyone understood Nelson's intentions. Captain Edward Riou, commanding the frigate's squadron attacking Trekroner Fort, saw Parker's order through the smoke. Unable to observe whether Nelson had repeated the signal, Riou believed the withdrawal was genuine. Reluctantly, he ordered his frigates to disengage. It was a heartbreaking decision. For hours, Riou's lighter ships had endured devastating fire from the powerful fortress. As HMS Amazon turned away, the last ship to leave the fight, a cannonball tore through her stern. Riou stood encouraging his exhausted sailors. "Come then, my boys, let us all die together." Moments later, another cannonball struck him with terrible force, killing him instantly. One of Britain's finest officers had fallen. Yet elsewhere, the battle was unmistakably turning in Britain's favor. One after another, Danish ships ceased firing. British boats began rowing toward surrendered vessels to take possession of them. But as they approached, several Danish shore batteries continued shooting. To Nelson, this violated every accepted custom of naval warfare. Furious, he chose diplomacy backed by overwhelming force. He drafted a letter addressed to the Danish commander and sent it ashore beneath a flag of truce. Its message was unmistakable. If the firing continued, he warned, the British would be forced to burn every captured floating battery, even though doing so would inevitably kill the brave Danish sailors still aboard. It was both a threat and an offer of mercy. The letter reached Crown Prince Frederick, who watched the battle from Copenhagen's citadel. By the time the prince received Nelson's message, the military situation had deteriorated dramatically. British guns had shifted farther north, systematically destroying the remaining Danish resistance. HMS Defiance battered the new Danish flagship until Commodore Olfert Fischer was forced to transfer his command once again, this time ashore too. Trekroner Fort. One by one, Danish vessels hauled down their flags. Holstein surrendered. Then came Seisted. Soon afterward, the remaining ships throughout the line followed. The defensive barrier protecting Copenhagen was collapsing. After relentless hours of combat, the outcome could no longer be denied. Shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Crown Prince Frederick accepted Nelson's proposal for a ceasefire. The guns finally fell silent. The Battle of Copenhagen was over. As the battered British fleet slowly withdrew through the narrow channel, danger still lurked beneath the surface. Several damaged ships collided. Others ran aground while attempting to leave the harbor. Even Nelson's own flagship, HMS Elephant, became stranded for hours before it could finally be refloated. The difficult withdrawal served as a reminder of how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Without careful preparation and without Nelson's willingness to adapt under fire, the entire operation might easily have ended in catastrophe. At 4:30 that afternoon, tragedy struck one final time. The burning Danish flagship reached her powder magazine. A massive explosion shattered the silence over King's Deep, killing more than 200 men in an instant. Only then did the smoke begin to clear. The battle had ended. Its cost was written across the shattered wrecks that still floated in Copenhagen harbor. Chapter 5: Victory and Legacy. The Road to Trafalgar. As evening settled over Copenhagen harbor, the smoke of battle slowly drifted away. The fighting had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. For Britain, the Battle of Copenhagen was far more than a tactical success. It was a decisive demonstration that the Royal Navy remained the dominant maritime power in Europe. Against formidable defenses, difficult navigation, and overwhelming uncertainty, Nelson had achieved what many believed impossible. The cost, however, had been severe. Of the 18 Danish vessels defending the main line, 12 had fallen into British hands. One of them, Holstein, was taken into Royal Navy service as HMS Nassau. Most of the remaining captured ships were too badly damaged to be of any use and were destroyed where they lay. Denmark's losses were devastating. Hundreds of sailors, soldiers, and civilian volunteers had been killed or wounded while defending their capital. Britain also paid a heavy price. More than 250 officers and sailors lost their lives, while hundreds more were wounded. Several British ships required extensive repairs before they could return to active service. Yet military victory alone was not enough. Britain still needed to achieve its political objective. The ceasefire agreed after the battle provided an opportunity for negotiations. Rather than pressing the attack against Copenhagen itself, Nelson sought to persuade the Danish government that continued resistance served no purpose. His conduct during the negotiations surprised many. Although he had defeated the Danish fleet, Nelson spoke with genuine respect for his former enemies. He openly praised the courage of the Danish defenders, remarking that they had fought with extraordinary determination for 4 hours under relentless bombardment. His words helped ease tensions between the two nations and created the foundation for a diplomatic settlement. The driving force behind the League of Armed Neutrality was suddenly gone. Without Paul's leadership, Denmark no longer feared immediate Russian retaliation for negotiating with Britain. The Danish government quickly suspended its participation in the League and agreed to a 14-week armistice. British warships could once again sail through the Baltic and obtain the vital naval supplies that Britain depended upon. The alliance that had threatened British naval supremacy began to collapse almost overnight. The campaign also marked a turning point in Nelson's own career. Admiral Sir Hyde Parker was recalled to England. His cautious leadership had been overshadowed by Nelson's bold victory, and the Admiralty selected Nelson to replace him as Commander-in-Chief in the Baltic. New honors soon followed. Nelson received additional noble titles, further cementing his reputation as Britain's greatest living naval commander. When he returned home that summer, he was welcomed not merely as a successful admiral, but as a national icon whose name had become synonymous with courage and victory. For a brief moment, it seemed that Europe might finally find peace. Later that year, Britain and France signed a preliminary peace agreement, raising hopes that nearly a decade of war was coming to an end. But the peace would prove fragile. Old rivalries soon resurfaced, and Europe once again drifted toward conflict. Less than 2 years after his triumph at Copenhagen, Horatio Nelson returned to sea for what would become the final campaign of his extraordinary life. Off the coast of Spain, near Cape Trafalgar, destiny awaited him. There, Nelson would fight the battle that secured Britain's command of the seas for more than a century and would immortalize his name forever.